Te damos la bienvenida a esta edición de práctica de autoestudio de inglés. En la descripción del video podrás encontrar un enlace para hacer la práctica, además de la transcripción de la historia.
The Whispering Manor. Deep in the woods beyond the old town stood an old house that most people avoided. Nobody seemed to know what it had originally been called. Around town, people simply referred to it as the Whispering Manor. Whether the name came from the wind moving through the trees or from something else entirely depended on who was telling the story. Many years ago, 4 friends decided to see the place for themselves. There was Edmund, who never believed a ghost story, no matter how convincing it sounded. There was also Lisa, who carried a notebook everywhere and enjoyed documenting things other people ignored. There was Jason, who loved telling frightening stories around campfires, though he wasn't always as brave as he pretended to be. And then there was Sophie, the youngest of the group. She only came because she hated being left behind. Like everyone else in town, they had grown up hearing stories about the manor. Some said a family had lived there long ago and disappeared during a harsh winter. Others claimed the father lost his mind and trapped his family inside before he himself vanished. The oldest residents whispered about stranger possibilities, that the forest had taken them somehow, swallowing them into the house until nothing remained. Edmund dismissed every version. "It's just an abandoned building, nothing more," he said as he turned on his flashlight. The trail narrowed as they walked. Before long, it was little more than a rough path winding between dense bushes. The trees crowded together overhead, allowing only soft rays of moonlight to reach the ground. Even Jason grew quieter the farther they went. After a while, the manor finally appeared. It stood at a small clearing, leaning slightly as though years of rain and neglect had worn it down. Most of the windows were broken, and vines crawled across the porch railings and up the walls. The front door hung unevenly from its hinges, moving with a slow creak that seemed strangely loud in the silence of the forest. Jason stopped at the edge of the clearing. "Last chance to back out," he said, but nobody answered. Instead, a moment later, they were climbing the porch steps. The front door opened with almost no resistance. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and stale air. Dust covered nearly everything, but the place didn't look completely abandoned. Through a wide entrance, they could see a dining table still standing in the center of the room, with 4 chairs pushed neatly around it. A grandfather clock rested against the wall, its hands unmoving, as if time itself had frozen. Toys were scattered around a faded rug, as if a child had left them there only hours earlier. "What if someone still comes here?" Sophie asked. Nobody had an answer, though. Lisa ran her hand along the staircase railing. "It feels warm," she said. "What?" Edmund laughed, but not as confidently as before. For a moment, after Lisa spoke, the house seemed to answer her with a weak sound from somewhere deeper inside. So weak that none of them could be sure they had heard it at all. They continued through the house, nervously moving from room to room. The living room walls were lined with faded photographs whose frames had crooked over the years. Most of the pictures showed the same family: a stern-looking father, a woman with kind eyes, and 2 young children. Nothing about the photographs was particularly unusual, yet Lisa found herself staring at them longer than she intended. There was something unsettling about the children's expressions. No matter where she stood in the room, she had the strange impression that they were watching her. Jason, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood with a joke about the family still charging rent to trespassers, but his words were swallowed almost immediately into the silence of the house. A few seconds later, a faint giggle drifted down from somewhere above them. Everyone froze. "That wasn't me," whispered Sophie. No one knew what to say. Edmund opened his mouth as if to give a rational explanation, but even he was too scared to break the silence. It's just some animals nesting on the upper floor," he muttered nervously, and sounding far less certain than he had when they had first entered the manor. The staircase creaked loudly beneath their weight as they climbed. At the top, they found a narrow hallway lined with closed doors, with most of the rooms appearing untouched for decades. Dust covered the furniture, the wallpaper peeled from the walls, and mold and stains spread across the ceilings. They entered a room that had once been a study. Shelves packed with books still stood against the walls, and Lisa absent-mindedly pulled one from its place. When she opened it, she discovered that every page was blank. Thinking it was some sort of unused journal, she grabbed another. It too was empty. Soon they were checking several volumes, only to find empty pages in all of them. The largest room sat at the end of the hall. Judging by the size of the bed and furniture, it must have belonged to the parents they saw in the old pictures. Most of the room looked abandoned like the rest of the house, but one object immediately caught their attention. A journal rested on the nightstand beside the bed, strangely free of dust. Lisa picked it up and, expecting to find only empty pages once more, flipped through its pages. This one, however, had lots of entries written. A passage near the middle made her stop. "The voices in the woods just won't stop anymore. I can hear them louder and closer every night, and the others are in denial. They recently started calling our names. They won't let us leave." The room fell silent, and a cold draft swept across their ankles. The boarded windows remained sealed, and yet the air seemed to move through the room as though an unseen door had been opened. Suddenly, soft whispers began. They started softly, easy to dismiss as sounds coming from within the creaks of old wood and settling beams. But the longer they listened, the more distinct the voices became. The sounds became murmurs, fragments spoken by overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. That's just the wind," Edmund insisted, though he could not explain why the voices sounded so disturbingly human. As if responding to the growing tension, the flashlights began to fail. Edmund's beam flickered first, then Jason's. Within moments, every flashlight in the group was dimming despite having fresh batteries. They decided it was time to leave. As the others started going back to the stairs, Sophie noticed something unusual along the hallway wall. A narrow door partially concealed behind strips of peeling wallpaper. None of them remembered seeing it before. Curious, she stepped closer and pulled it open. The room beyond showed no signs of decay. Fresh flowers rested on the windowsill. A neatly made bed stood in one corner, and the furniture was polished and clean. For a moment, Sophie wondered whether someone had secretly been living there. Then, a music box sitting atop the dresser began to play a soft and childlike melody, almost as if trying to distract the girl. Down the hallway, Lisa called her name. As Sophie turned to answer, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around and immediately grabbed the handle, but it refused to move. Panic surged through her chest as she pulled harder. The music box continued its gentle tune. Then, beneath the melody, she heard voices. Not distant this time. "Sister," the whisper seemed to brush past her ear. "Stay with us." Sophie pounded against the door and screamed for help. Meanwhile, the others had finally realized she was missing. They searched the hallway, calling her name repeatedly. Jason rushed downstairs after catching a glimpse of a small figure crossing the foyer below. For a split second, He thought it was Sophie, but the child vanished before he reached the staircase. When they attempted to leave through the front door, they found it completely stuck. Edmund threw his shoulder against it several times without success, nearly dislocating it. Their fear quickly turned into panic. As Lisa searched frantically through her notebook for anything she might have overlooked, she noticed unfamiliar writing on a page she had never used. The message had not been there earlier. You should not have come. For several seconds, none of them spoke. Around them, the house seemed to come alive. Floorboards creaked overhead, and doors opened and closed somewhere in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, no longer hiding within the sounds of the building. They surrounded the three friends like a crowd gathering just beyond sight. Desperate to escape, Edmund spotted a side window and smashed it with a nearby chair. Glass shattered outward into the night. One after another, they climbed through the opening and ran into the forest without looking back. They called Sophie's name the entire way, but she never answered. The search for Sophie lasted for days. Family members, volunteers, and local authorities combed the woods surrounding the old town. Every trail was checked, every abandoned structure was investigated, but nothing was found. When investigators returned to the clearing where the manor had stood, the house was gone. Not burned or demolished, it simply looked as if it had never been there. The clearing remained exactly where the survivors remembered it, sure, but there was no trace that a building ever occupied the space. No foundation, no debris, no broken glass from the shattered window. The ground appeared untouched, as though the forest had erased the manor completely. Years passed. Edmund eventually moved away. Lisa rarely discussed what happened. Jason abandoned his love of ghost stories altogether, yet none of them fully escaped the memory of that night. Sometimes, each would wake before dawn to the distant sound of a music box playing somewhere beyond their window. The melody was always the same, and if they listened carefully enough, they sometimes thought they could hear Sophie's voice hidden beneath it, calling softly from far away, inviting them to come home. Whether the story is true or not is impossible to say. Most people in town dismiss it as local folklore. Still, if you ever find yourself deep in unfamiliar woods and happen to spot an old house standing silently among the trees, it may be wise to keep walking. Some places are abandoned for a reason.